Committee will come to order. At the conclusion of opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 4795, and the bill was open for amendment at any point. First of all, are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, are there any amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will read the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4795 offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
And the staff will distribute the amendment, and the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, when a major new or expanding source of air pollution is trying to get a permit before they start construction, the Act recognizes that part of cleaning up the ongoing pollution is to minimize the amount of the new pollution that we're adding into the area. So in evaluating whether to give a permit or not, you look to see whether this new source or expanded source is going to be adding to pollution in the whole overall area. To obtain a permit for a new source, the company must first determine which pollution controls it will install to reduce the facility's emissions. Then the applicant must estimate how much pollution the facility will emit after they put in that pollution control, and the applicant must show that this quantity of pollution will not cause the whole area to exceed the national ambient air quality standards, which are the standards to protect public health. If the new facility's emissions will cause a violation of an air quality standard, the applicant must take additional steps to cut its pollution or obtain offsets for the excess pollution. EPA updates and strengthens the national air quality standards when the science says it is necessary to protect human health within an adequate margin of safety. But the bill before us allows certain facilities to disregard this science and ignore a new air quality standard when obtaining a permit. If EPA doesn't issue rules and guidance at the same time it issues a new air quality standard, the old unprotective air quality standard applies for the purposes of a pre-construction permit. This means that when a facility is demonstrating whether its emissions will violate the air quality standard, it would use the old, weaker standard as a benchmark. In effect, this bill before us gives new polluters amnesty from the applicable air quality standard. These facilities will be allowed to emit extra pollution at levels that could harm public health. At the legislative hearing on this bill, we heard from Delaware's Secretary of Natural Resources. He stated that this provision, quote, would likely cause substantial adverse health impacts by exempting sources from complying with health-based air quality standards, end quote. The California Air Resources Board, or CARB, sent a letter raising similar concerns, noting that the bill bars permitting agencies from applying the new air quality standard in the permitting process, even if public health concerns would otherwise warrant doing so, end quote. CARB argues that this bill could actually slow the permitting process by forcing states to wait for EPA guidance, even if the state doesn't think that guidance is necessary to issue permits. The state of Delaware told us the same thing. Section 3B of the bill is also, I think, bad for business. If one facility emits more than its fair share of pollution, other facilities will eventually have to pick up the slack and control more. So by granting amnesty to new sources of pollution, the bill shifts the pollution control responsibility to existing businesses. It makes a lot more sense when you're building a new facility to have them put into that new facility the ability to reduce the air pollution rather than go to an existing facility and have to buy the retrofits to lower the amount of emissions. And that has been the basis of the Clean Air Act from the very beginning in 1970. But this provision in the bill does the opposite. It allows new facilities to be built with insufficient pollution control, forcing more expensive controls on existing sources. That makes no sense. The amnesty provision in subsection 3B harms public health and burdens existing manufacturing facilities by allowing new facilities to pollute more than they would be allowed to do under current law. The EPA sets the national standard. The permits are not granted by EPA. They're granted by the state. The states are ready to grant or deny a permit even before EPA has established its further guidance beyond the standard. This bill would force the local permitting agency to use the old standard rather than the new standard. It's a delay, it gives them amnesty, and it causes greater air pollution, greater health problems. So I would urge support for this amendment, which would strike this particular section.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair will recognize the gentleman from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak against the amendment. My friend from California talks about a loophole. If you look at this amendment could be called the EPA loophole. This amendment would actually grant EPA a loophole from the accountability that we're trying to put into law with this bill. In fact, if you look at the bill itself, it doesn't relieve any new facilities of any obligations. In fact, it says that a new facility must install, quote, best available control technology in attainment areas. So the bill still ensures that the best available technology will be used, but what it does is it puts the onus on the EPA to actually show how you can achieve it. If the EPA wants to come up with some new standard, and they come up with new standards all the time that are completely unachievable, and they know it, their intention isn't to try to clean up the environment. Their goal is to deny permits. That shouldn't be their job. Their job shouldn't be to prevent manufacturing in the United States, but that's what they're doing. The EPA literally is denying billions of dollars of investment in this country. Not to save the environment. They're sending jobs to China and India and other countries that have much lower standards. In fact, they don't have the good standards that we have in America today. So if you're concerned about emissions, let's have those jobs here and those permits issued here in America where we actually have good standards. And in fact, according to this bill, we'll have even higher standards because it mandates that they have to use the best available control technology. But what the bill also does, and it's done in Section 3B, the section that the gentleman from California is trying to strike, the bill says that if the EPA is going to come out with this new standard, they have to show how you can achieve it at the same time. You actually have to give the guidance. Show people how they can do it. We had a hearing on this exact issue when we had a hearing on the legislation. And at the hearing, Ken White's a managing partner for Environmental Resources Management and a permitting engineer testified, quote, "What I would like to know is what do you want me to do to make the demonstration? And right now, in a lot of cases, that guidance doesn't exist." Industry's looking for guidance. If EPA is coming out with a standard, they're saying, just show me how I can do it. How can I achieve it? And EPA won't show them because EPA doesn't want them to get the permit. They don't want to have a standard that's achievable. Well, that's not their job. Their job is to follow the laws that Congress passes. And if they want to come out with a new standard, they ought to show how it can be achieved. Right now, the law doesn't require them to do that. And in many cases, they refuse to show how it can be achieved, knowing that that de facto denies the permit. And that's not their role. And so what this does is just puts accountability in place. I'd be happy to yield, yeah.
The permits are granted at the state level. And so the state could grant the permit, but the bill says they can't grant the permit under the new standard unless EPA gives them some guidance, but they don't need that guidance. In effect, the bill will stop the granting of permits.
No, reclaiming my time.
The
bill,
with dirtier standards.
Reclaiming my time. The permits are already being denied. The bill just says if you're going to come out with the standard, also come out with the guidance at the same time. If you know this is something that can be done, this is something that's going to save the planet, then show it. Show the science. Show your data. You got some research? Put it up there. Pony up. And if you don't have it, then what's a standard about anyway? The standard is about denying
yield,
jobs in America.
They have the
and
science.
So what we're
to set the
saying is,
standard.
and just to finish up on this, again, if you look at Section 3B, Section 3B is the accountability and transparency component of the bill. The component that actually requires EPA to put up or shut up. If you've got this great new rule that you want to put out there, you said it's going to do some great things for the country, for the environment, show people how it can be achieved. Because too often it can't be achieved. You talk to industry, the people that are investing billions of dollars. And this isn't billions of dollars that are just going to be invested in America. If they can't do that work in America, they're going to go somewhere else, and they are going to other countries. Those jobs are going to other countries. Just look at the jobs reports. It's one of the reasons that we're losing so many jobs in this country. The investment's there. But our government, through the EPA and some of these other radical agencies, are running those jobs to other countries. So we that says, here, if there's something good, show people how you can do it. And if it can't be done, then you're just going to have to figure out how it can be done before you can bring that rule forward. So again, this is the kind of transparency and accountability that people in the real world, people that actually live with these rules, have been begging for. You know, hard workers who are looking for jobs, these people that are on unemployment lines. They don't want all these excuses. They don't want to hear about how EPA is shutting down jobs in America. They're saying, if you've got a rule, put the guidance out there. Let's get these jobs created. Let's get these billions of dollars of investments off the sidelines and, more importantly, out of China's pocketbook and put it back in America. So it's a good bill. This amendment would actually create a loophole for the EPA to avoid accountability, and I'd urge a no vote, and I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not necessarily looking to debate the gentleman from Louisiana, but, you know, when he talks about China and some of these other countries where the air quality standards are so bad people can barely breathe, I don't even know how, you know, he brings that up in making his comparison. You have to wear a mask in China, in a lot of these areas. I would urge support for Mr. Waxman's amendment. Regulated entities claim that EPA isn't issuing implementation rules and guidance quickly enough after updating a national ambient air quality standard. And the bill concludes that the solution is to sacrifice public health by allowing facilities to ignore the new air quality standard. And I reject the trade-off suggested by this bill. I'm not willing to expose our kids to unhealthy air in order to speed up permits for polluters. But even if you are willing to sacrifice air quality for faster permits, that isn't what this bill does. This bill allows some facilities to pollute more while doing nothing to expedite the permitting process. In fact, it would do just the opposite. Under the Clean Air Act, a company that wants to build a new facility must obtain a pre-construction permit that requires the facility to control its pollution. The goal of this permitting process is simple: to ensure that the facility will not significantly increase air pollution above levels that are safe to breathe. Under this bill, if EPA issues a new national ambient air quality standard, that standard doesn't apply for permitting purposes unless and until EPA has issued implementation rules and guidance for the new standard. Besides allowing unhealthy levels of air pollution, this provision doesn't even help states speed up permitting. Mr. Waxman mentioned Delaware. The Delaware Secretary of Natural Resources testified that concurrent guidance isn't always practical or necessary. EPA told the committee the same, that most guidance evolves after a standard takes effect as states and industry raise questions that require EPA guidance. The California Air Resources Board wrote a letter to the committee, and it says, I quote, "Permitting agencies have historically been the advisors to U.S. EPA on the guidance it ultimately releases," end of quote. It's unclear how EPA could provide guidance on solving problems before they even know what those problems are. Basically, the bill creates a catch-22 for EPA. On the one hand, EPA could hurry to issue guidance before hearing questions from states and industry. That guidance will be incomplete, as it won't address issues that only emerge during the implementation process. An industry group that wanted to delay implementation of the new air quality standard could file a lawsuit saying that EPA's guidance wasn't sufficient. On the other hand, EPA could wait to issue more robust and helpful guidance, but in the meantime, facilities would be able to obtain permits under the old air quality standard, and a company could build a facility that's allowed to pollute more than it would under current law. So in both scenarios, the polluter wins and the public health loses. And this would provide an opportunity for even more lawsuits and delay. My Republican colleagues always say, oh, you know, they don't like lawsuits. Well, this is going to create even more lawsuits. Downwind communities and nearby businesses might challenge a permit that allows a new facility to pollute more and shifts the burden of pollution reduction on them. Well, all said, this bill amounts to more litigation, more confusion, and mostly more pollution. There is no reason to believe that it will result in faster permitting. And Mr. Waxman's amendment would strike just the language in the bill that exempts facilities from complying with new air quality standards, and I urge my colleagues to support his amendment. I yield to Mr. Waxman.
Let me explain conceptually what the law requires. The law requires that when you build facilities, the states develop a plan, the local government develops a plan to meet the health-based standards. Now, if they change the health-based standards, they have to do so based on the science. And EPA will often issue guidelines for recommendations. But local areas don't always need those recommendations because they'll have their own plan on how to get the area in attainment or keep it from going into non-attainment. And so if there's a new facility that wants to open up, this bill would say you cannot require them to do more than they used to be required to do under the less protective standard. So they can ignore the standard completely, and the local government must issue the permit under the old standard. Well, we've got a new standard. It's based on the science. So the permit ought to be decided by the local government. This bill takes the power away from the local government and says they have to require them only to do what they would have been required to do if they had to meet a lower standard for protecting public health. And that is unnecessary. We ought to let the decision be up to the local people to figure out their own plan and not have Washington tell them they must pollute more because EPA didn't send some voluntary guidance for the local government to follow. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing, gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 3B is really the cornerstone of this piece of legislation. I want to commend my colleagues, and it's more about process. It's not changing the substantive requirements. Nothing in the bill changes the requirement of new facilities to install the most advanced emission control technologies. And Dr. Cassidy had offered an amendment to clarify that in the subcommittee. Nothing in the bill changes the obligation of new facilities in areas that are in attainment with national ambient air quality standards to install, quote unquote, the best control technologies, as my friend Mr. Scalise said, to address emissions. Nothing in the bill changes the obligation of new facilities in areas that are not in attainment with such standards to install, and I quote, the lowest available emissions rate technology to improve air quality. As a practical matter, the bill will accelerate implementation of new air quality standards. And just to a point of the debate that we're having now in our country today on greenhouse gas, part of our debate is, show us where technology is available to meet these standards. And the answer is, we're showing you a plant being built that's $100 million, has $100 million of DOE loans, and is $2 billion in deficit spending, and is still not generating electricity. That's what the EPA will use to say that here is a standard that can be attained by this technology when that technology is nor affordable nor actually in process. So all this bill is doing, in that section that says, show us how we can do it before you promulgate these rules. That's why we can't permit the Waxman Amendment, which would gut that provision. And I'd like to yield to Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you very much. And I would just like to say that last year we had a number of Clean Air Act forums. And we had about 16, 17 state EPA representatives in to talk about this issue and others. And many of them expressed concern. Now, I'm going to quote from two this morning, but I could quote from more. Colorado's Department of Public Health and Environment said, the absence of timely implementation guidance produces a lack of clarity on state implementation plan expectations and often creates considerable uncertainty in the planning process. Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality said, too often standards are promulgated without the technical implementation rules in place. This places states in an extremely difficult position. And then most recently, the National Association of Clean Air Agencies stated in a letter to EPA, we cannot overstate how critically important it is that EPA ensure that future implementation rules and guidance documents are developed, proposed, and finalized on a much more accelerated timeline. Ideally, EPA should propose the requirements for the State Implementation Plan rule at the same time a final National Ambient Air Quality Standard is promulgated. And I would remind everyone that even today there are significant parts of this country that are in non-compliance with the last National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And when the new standard comes out, the fact that the states are confused because of a lack of guidance and implementation from EPA when they set the new standard creates an impediment to meeting the new standard. So I think that Mr. Scalise's legislation is a practical, common sense approach that even the states. Now, the gentleman from Delaware, who also was at the Clean Air Act Forum, his state has been able to comply anyway. But many of these states have not been able to do it, and they are asking us to tell EPA to come forth with the guidance, regulations, when they adopt the new standard. And so that's all that this legislation does, and I yield back to the gentleman from Illinois.
And I'll just finish by saying, again, Section 3B simply makes, we believe, obviously there's disagreement on the other side, we believe it makes the EPA accountable for issuing regulations and guidance needed to navigate the permitting process in a timely fashion, and that's all we're trying to do, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the question occurs on the amendment offered. Oh, Mr. Tompkins, I'm sorry.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment offered by our ranking member. It does not fix everything that is wrong with this legislation, but it does improve the bill. This legislation has the potential to undermine the great progress we have made in improving public health by reducing air pollution. And the bill is based on the false assumption that the pre-construction permitting programs implemented by the states are a major barrier to reestablishing manufacturing here in the United States. Establishing a requirement for EPA to issue all guidance simultaneously with the final rule does nothing to streamline the pre-construction process. It simply undermines public health protection. This legislation assumes that we must choose between clean, healthy air and a robust and vibrant economy. We do not. Our experience under the Clean Air Act has demonstrated that clean air and economic development are compatible. Since the adoption of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, new businesses have started. The economy has grown and the air is cleaner and healthier for all of us. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards set by EPA are based upon years of research on the impacts of air pollutants on human health and the environment. While our colleague claims to offer a bill that would encourage new projects, in reality, this bill increases the burdens on existing businesses. Existing businesses will be burdened with having to do more to maintain their area in attainment to compensate for a new business complying with a less stringent standard. This is not a fair application of the law. It won't deliver more jobs or better air quality. States want to encourage economic development. They want to work with the regulated community to provide certainty and to process permits in a fair and a timely fashion. It is the states that develop comprehensive implementation plans that take account of all pollution sources and balance the needs of all stakeholders in the effort to achieve cleaner air. Section 3B of the bill would result in greater confusion, more legal challenges, and a less flexible regulatory process. EPA issues guidance to assist the states and regulated businesses with compliance. Guidance is useful for the regulated community. As new situations are encountered, the agency can work to find the most appropriate and cost-effective means for moving projects forward under the law. We should ensure that regulations are implemented fairly and consistently, and we should encourage the agency to work with states and regulated entities. This bill does the opposite. If the agency would call a standard into question by issuing guidance after a regulation is finalized, why would the agency ever do that? I don't see how the lack of guidance helps an applicant to comply with the law and move forward with their project. Section 3 of the bill creates problems for states and for permit applicants. The Waxman Amendment ensures that we will not sacrifice public health progress we have made under the Clean Air Act. It ensures certainty and fairness in the regulatory process, and for that reason and many others, I urge support for this amendment. And
Would the gentleman yield? The gentleman yield his time?
I will yield.
Thank you. I just wanted to suggest to my Republican colleagues that there's a much simpler and more effective way to expedite the permitting process, and that is to stop cutting the budget for the EPA and state permitting agencies. You know, how can we realistically expect the EPA and state permitting agencies to do more work more quickly with fewer and fewer resources, which is the reality that they face? And we should give them the resources and staff they need to review and process permits on a timely basis. That's the real solution here, rather than just the talking points that we're hearing from the other side. I yield back to Mr. Tonka.
And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by Mr. Waxman. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair. Noes have it. Roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the tally.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield.
No.
Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. No. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. No. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. No. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. No. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorse Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilrakis. Mr. Bilrakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshu. Ms. Eshu votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Members wishing to cast a vote? Dr. Murphy?
Mr. Murphy says no.
Mr. Braley?
Mr. Braley votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 18 ayes and 27 nays.
18 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from Colorado, does he have an amendment at the desk?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4795, offered by Mr. Gardner of Colorado.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I thank the chairman for the time. This is an important issue to discuss in regards to this bill today, but I intend to withdraw the amendment while continuing my work with the sponsor of the legislation. H.R. 4795 addresses concerns about permitting delays for major source air permits required under the Clean Air Act's New Source Review Program. These are typically air permits for large manufacturing or industrial facilities. At the legislative hearing, we heard testimony that these types of permits can require anywhere from 1 to 3 years. We also heard testimony about how delays in obtaining these major source permits can present significant roadblocks to new manufacturing. In addition to delays for major source permits, my understanding is that the process for obtaining even a minor source permit, which is a permit issued by states to smaller emitting sources, can also be a roadblock to new manufacturing. There is a manufacturer in my state which is a leading technical ceramics manufacturer, providing critical components, assemblies, and engineered solutions to the aerospace and defense, semiconductor, oil and gas, automotive, household durables, and other industries. That manufacturer wanted to install a new minor emissions source at one of its facilities here in the United States, and at the same time, one of its facilities in South Korea. For the exact same piece of equipment, the state agency in the United States expedited the company's permitting request, and the company received approval in 6 months in the United States. For a similar type of air permit for the same piece of equipment, South Korea took 2 weeks. We all understand that states face many challenges in the permitting process, including EPA rules with which states must comply. At the same time, manufacturers need to be responsive to market demands and competition. My amendment would simply allow for minor source permits that, while the permit application is being processed, that a project application could, at their own risk, undertake certain supporting pre-construction activities before a decision was made on the final permit. These supporting pre-construction activities would include installation of building supports and foundations, laying underground pipework, and construction of permanent storage structures. These activities would not, and I again repeat, these activities would not include any physical change or change in the method of operation that would result in a change in emissions of the emissions unit. I believe this is a proposal that we should consider and continue to consider. Our manufacturers have to compete in the global marketplace. This amendment would allow them to better compete while still ensuring environmental protection. And I don't want to see American manufacturing going overseas simply due to permitting delays here at home. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the committee's indulgence and I withdraw the amendment, but it's an important issue that I believe we should continue to discuss.
The gentleman asks that his amendment be withdrawn. So be it. Are there other amendments? Other amendments to be offered? Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney, has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the title.
Amendment to H.R. 4795, offered by Mr. McNerney of California.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Waxman just explained why we should strike Section 3B from this bill. Section 3B creates a loophole in the Clean Air Act that allows new facilities to meet old air quality standards. This loophole harms public health, burdens existing facilities, and creates regulatory uncertainty. Nonetheless, the committee just rejected Mr. Waxman's amendment to strike this provision. Okay, if the committee is unwilling to remove the provision from the bill, then we should at very least give state and local permitting authorities the opportunity to opt out. That's exactly what my amendment does. We know states have concerns about Section 3B. We heard strong concerns from the state of Delaware at the hearing on this bill in the subcommittee. And in my own state, the California Air Resources Board, also called CARB, wrote to the committee last week to express their concerns about this legislation and this provision in particular. CARB wrote that, and I quote, "The provisions proposed in this bill would not increase efficiency, would result in additional delays in permitting, and would pose increased public health risks." CARB made 2 key points. First, states don't need EPA guidance to issue permits under the new air quality standard. CARB stated, and I quote again, "For decades, permitting authorities have successfully implemented their programs in response to every new standard U.S. EPA has promulgated. In fact, permitting agencies have historically been advisors to the U.S. EPA on guidance that it ultimately issues." End quote. CARB pointed out that the bill effectively requires the EPA to issue, and I quote, "one-size-fits-all permit guidance that could not realistically take into account the uniqueness of every jurisdiction."
Keep going.
Thank you. CARB also explained that in regions with severe air quality issues,
I think that's a warning to withdraw your amendment like the previous member. Where's your car?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. CARB also explained that regions with severe air quality issues, barring the states from issuing permits consistent with the new, more healthy, protective air quality standards will, quote, result in unnecessary delays and public health risks. CARB highlighted that this is particularly an issue for vulnerable and already overburdened populations, such as in disadvantaged communities. Parts of my district and all of California's San Joaquin Valley are in extreme non-attainment for air quality standards. This bill threatens the flexibility needed by regional air pollution control districts, the flexibility that has led to 2013 being the cleanest year on record in the region. This bill would be a step backward in that process. Let's not make state air pollution regulators' jobs harder by constraining their flexibility and imposing counterproductive requirements, and let's at least give them a choice. My amendment simply states that if a federal, state, local, or tribal agency determines that adopting this loophole will increase air pollution that harms human health, slow issuance of permits, key, or increase regulatory uncertainty, create new litigation, shift the burden of pollution control to small businesses and other existing facilities, or increase the cost of achieving breathable air, then that agency can opt out. The agency does not have to issue a permit that exempts new facilities from meeting protective air quality standards. If the bill's Clean Air Act loophole doesn't cause these problems, then states shouldn't opt out, and you shouldn't object to my amendment. But just in case the states we have heard from are correct, let's provide a safety hatch to make sure that we aren't harming public health and making air pollution permitting more difficult. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I object to my friend from California's amendment. Again, this section of the bill, 3B, is about putting accountability onto the backs of the EPA, finally forcing the EPA to have to pony up and say, if you've got some new standard, you've got all this great science behind the standard, then show it to us. Show us how it can be done. Now, why would you want a local state to be able to exempt themselves from accountability of the EPA? And this isn't about some kind of waiver you're granting a state. This is something that each individual job creator, these companies that are trying to invest billions of dollars in America, are asking for. The state's not asking for the permit. It's the job creator. The job creator wants that accountability on EPA, and frankly, those thousands of workers that might actually get a job at that new plant that won't be built. It'll be built in China, where people wear the masks because they pollute, instead of America, where we have good standards. And again, getting back to this idea of what the current standards are, the bill says they've already have to use the latest technologies. What this amendment would do would say a state could just exempt the EPA from accountability in that state. The EPA shouldn't be exempt from accountability anywhere. If the EPA's got a good idea, show us how it's a good idea. Show us how it can actually be done, as opposed to what the EPA does too often, is to put a standard out that they know can't be done. They know there's no science behind it that can prove how it can be done, and yet they put it out anyway to kill jobs in America, to carry out some agenda that they've got. Their agenda should be helping create American jobs and invoking good standards. And if it's a good standard, then just show how you can do it. Don't allow them to be exempted from accountability. No one should be exempted from accountability. If a state wants to exempt accountability at the federal government and still put the burden on their local businesses, you wonder why some states are bleeding jobs. But ultimately, we're concerned about American jobs. This bill will help kickstart billions of dollars of American investment that will create really good jobs. And in fact, so many of the states have said they want this guidance. They want the mandate on the EPA that if they're to come out with a new standard, show us how you can do it. Because they want to protect, not the federal government. They're not concerned about protecting the EPA from accountability, like this amendment would do. They're trying to actually protect the ability to create American jobs, which is at risk. If you don't think it's at risk, Just look at the millions of people who are looking for work today. While there's billions of dollars of money that wants to be invested in America that's being forced to other countries. They're forcing those plants to be built in China where people wear those masks from New Jersey talks about. Let's build those jobs here where we have higher standards. And if there's even higher standards we should put in place, all this bill says is show the guidance. Show how it can be done. Because if it can't be done, it's junk science. It's not real science if you can't do it. If you can't prove that it can be done, then the standard shouldn't be brought forward. We ought to have accountability on every federal agency. This bill finally brings that transparency and accountability forward. The amendment would actually allow a state to exempt the EPA from accountability. That's the last thing we ought to be doing when the EPA is probably singly responsible for more lost jobs in this country than any other federal agency under this administration, and that's saying a lot. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to vote no. Hopefully we avoid this flood warning that's going on outside. But let's stop this flood of radical regulations that's coming down from the EPA. Maybe that's what the warning ought to be about. And kill this amendment, bring the accountability to the EPA that they deserve and that people all across the country are asking for. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman, for 5 minutes.
That speech sounded so good, but it was absolutely misleading. Even before you hear my argument, you disagree. It was misleading because the argument was we want to hold EPA accountable. So EPA sets a standard based on the science, and then they have usually some additional recommendations, which don't have to be followed because they don't issue the permits. The permits are issued at the local level. So the bill said, if they don't give the guidance, we're not going to punish EPA. We're going to let the facility meet a lower standard which will allow more pollution than otherwise would be required. They punish the people living in the area. And that means they punish them because they don't have the lower emissions reductions that would be necessary to meet that standard. Now, do we think only EPA can decide how that standard should be met? EPA doesn't decide that. It's the local government. And the bill says a local government cannot make a decision that my Republican friends disagree with. They're saying if EPA doesn't give some guidance, some suggestions, the local government cannot give a permit to meet the standard. They got to give a permit that would lead to not meeting the health-based standard. That's what's going on. Now, will this keep jobs from going to China? That's absolute nonsense. If somebody wants to go to China, they'll go to China. But they want a permit to locate somewhere in the United States. And the local government issues a permit based on the air pollution in the area. And if the new source is going to add to that air pollution, they will be required to use the best available control technology. And if that's not enough, they'll have to do some other things like offsets. But the Republican bill would say, oh, they don't have to do that. They only have to do what was necessary before we realize we need a better standard to protect public health. So the bill takes away the ability of the local government to make the decision because Washington knows best, and they're going to say that we want these local permits to be granted and more pollution to result. We don't care what the local people want. The McNerney Amendment simply says, we'll leave it up to the local government to decide this issue. What's wrong with that? I used to hear from the Republicans that they believe in states' rights. They believe in states' rights only when it's to make things weaker, protections weaker, whether it's environmental or other protections for individuals. We ought to let the local government decide how they're going to clean up the pollution or stop adding to it. And this bill would permit additional pollution by making sure that the new source will meet the lowest standard. And then when the local government figures out its inventory, how much pollution they have, they'll say, well, if we're not getting enough of a reduction by the new source, we're going to have to make some existing source reduce even more. And that's not going to be so welcomed unless you also want to add, which I presume some of you might want, to say that we don't have anybody have to do anything. We'll just let people breathe in air that harms their health. So I think McNerney's amendment is a pro-local government amendment, and I urge people to support it. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members, Dr. Cassidy.
This is Bill. I submitted an amendment last week to I think hopefully improve it. It'll help provide for transparent, efficient processing, permitting process. And let's put this in perspective. Absolutely, government regulations cost jobs. We just had an economy that shrank last quarter. Working class Americans are taking it on the chin. The best predictor of health is whether or not somebody has a job with private insurance. And we're passing regulations which increasingly endanger that. This is personal to my district. Chemical manufacturing in Louisiana is our second largest manufacturing industry, employing about 23,000 people across the state. Great jobs with great benefits that people want to have. Now, there's 181 more such projects announced nationwide. And again, this is important for my state. Of these 181, 39 are announced in Louisiana, representing about $29 billion in new investment. Now, this is 8,000 new direct jobs. The kind of jobs that, my gosh, shovel-ready projects are supposed to create, this will actually create. That said, the current permitting process creates delays and creates uncertainty. We also know the EPA is about to release new ozone standards later this year, creating more uncertainty. As one example, in April, the Baton Rouge Chamber of Commerce wrote to the EPA's Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee about the potential ozone standard revision. They said such a revision would significantly damage the business economy in Baton Rouge and the entire state of Louisiana. Let me translate. That means there's fewer jobs for working Americans, who in this case happen to live in Louisiana. Now, just last week, EPA proposed sweeping new power sector regulations, again threatening our manufacturing renaissance. For example, in Louisiana, EPA is proposing a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions between 2012 and 2030. If this is allowed to proceed unchecked, it'll raise electricity prices and jeopardize job growth. It just makes sense. You have certain input costs. One is labor, the other is energy. We cannot compete with countries like China on labor costs, so we have to beat them on energy cost. When we lose on energy, we lose the job. What Mr. Scalise said is absolutely true. Now, I introduced a bill, the Energy Consumers Relief Act, which hopefully would increase Congress's power to check the EPA. This act provided for more transparency and more interagency review of programs with projected costs of more than $1 billion, requiring the EPA to be transparent about cost and that other agencies review EPA's rules for their economy-wide impact. It passed the House with bipartisan support, awaiting consideration in the Senate. Another bill promoting transparency, Mr. Whitfield with Senator Manchin, also introduced a bill that would serve as a check on EPA's recently proposed power plant rules. Now, I wish Mr. Senator Reed would accept these bills. That said, I'm not sure he is, although I've sent a letter asking him to do so. We've been presented in this country with an opportunity for a manufacturing renaissance, bringing new jobs for working Americans with new prosperity. We should be supporting new manufacturing and job creation. We should not allow the EPA, unchecked, to continue to take actions that will squander this opportunity. I urge support for H.R. 4795. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Florida. I'm sorry. I saw her hand first for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Mr. McNerney's amendment, and I thank him for offering it. Colleagues, Section 3 of the bill requires EPA to issue implementation rules and guidance. At the same time, it issues a new national ambient air quality standard. If EPA does not meet this requirement, the bill doles out a punishment. But this is not well thought out, colleagues on the other side of the aisle, because it's not EPA that pays the penalty. It's the public health that gets hurt, or it's other businesses in the area. that are harmed. Under Section 3B of the Republican bill, until EPA issues the required regulations and guidance, new sources of pollution get amnesty from certain Clean Air Act requirements when applying for a pre-construction permit. A new facility doesn't have to prove that its pollution won't violate the new air quality standard. It only has to show that its pollution won't violate the old one. But EPA can only update an air quality standard if the existing standard isn't strong enough to protect public health. So my Republican colleagues are urging that the law apply outdated air quality standards for permitting, thereby creating a loophole in the Clean Air Act that could allow new facilities to emit more pollution than is safe. This amnesty provision threatens public health, and it's also unfair to the existing businesses in the area. In an area with unhealthy air, pollution is a zero-sum game. An increase in pollution in one place has to be offset by reductions elsewhere. So if new facilities are allowed to emit more, as this bill would allow, existing facilities have to emit less to make up for that extra pollution. So what about those jobs? And adding pollution controls to existing sources is usually much more expensive than building in the controls up front. At the legislative hearing on this bill, the Delaware Secretary of Natural Resources testified that the bill's amnesty provision will produce confusion and uncertainty. That can cost jobs as well. And EPA echoed this concern in its technical assistance to the committee. The result would be more litigation and permitting delays. So in sum, this provision offers more air pollution, more pollution control costs for existing businesses, more litigation, and more permitting delays. Now, Mr. Waxman offered an amendment to get rid of this amnesty provision entirely, and that would have been my preferred approach. But if the majority will not agree to that, at a minimum, we should allow states and local communities to ask key questions and decide for themselves whether the bill's approach of applying outdated air quality standards is a good idea. If states decide that the amnesty provision makes things worse, they shouldn't be bound by it. And that's exactly what Mr. McNerney's amendment provides, and that's smart. This amendment lets a state reject the Republican amnesty provision if the state finds that it would have a harmful effect, such as slowing permitting, or increasing air pollution and harming the public health, or raising the cost of pollution controls, or creating regulatory uncertainty. The two state air quality regulators have told the committee that the amnesty provision will have serious consequences and would be harmful to their permitting efforts. If a state finds that this Clean Air Act loophole will cause harm, the state should be able to opt out and simply apply the updated, more protective air quality standard. We often hear from my Republican friends that we should leave more decisions to states and local communities. That's all Mr. McNerney's amendment does. The amendment allows each local agency to make its own decision about whether this amnesty provision will help or impede its permitting. I urge everyone
Would the
to
gentlelady
support
yield
this
for
common
a
sense
question?
amendment.
Would the gentlelady yield just for a second for a question?
I'd be happy to yield.
You know, my friends on the other side keep saying, the businesses will be harmed. I have not heard from a single business who's been opposed to this piece of legislation. And so I'm wondering if you all could name me a business that's come to you that said, don't pass this because this will harm us.
I think those businesses...
Well, I'm asking if there's a single business that you can name because it's been mentioned four
Oh,
times.
you're going to hear from those businesses.
Well, we should have done it.
Will affect all
we should have
the
done it by now. They
businesses
should
in
be
those
talking to
areas.
us if you have their names.
This, Mr. Shimkus, this will affect all of the businesses in the area and make their lives much more complicated, and it could...
Well, thank you.
So I yield back.
Thank you for yielding. I just would like to know who they are.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair would recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Ashley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to ask Mr. Scalise to explain why the whole issue around local and state governments and their role in these decisions is something that you oppose. I'm asking this very sincerely. I don't get that piece. So
I'd be happy if the gentleman wanted to rework the amendment to allow states to opt out of the rules, the standard that the EPA would be coming out with.
No.
There's a new unachievable standard
I was
EPA is coming
yielding
out with.
time to
Let the states
sir,
opt out of that.
Mr. Scalise, I was yielding time to you to answer the question, because both in the debate and the discussion on the Waxman Amendment and now on Mr. McNerney's, there is a strong opposition to, strong opposition to Mr. Waxman's. We had the vote. But there is a very important piece in this. I served on the Air District Board in my region for almost 10 years before I came to the House. So I know what that permitting process is. Why are you leapfrogging over that? How do you answer that piece?
Would the
I'd be
gentleman
happy to yield.
Thanks. First of all, I think if you look at the base of the bill is about putting accountability on the EPA.
No, but wait a minute.
I think we ought to want to put accountability on the EPA.
Reclaiming my time.
If you'd like me to answer.
We've gone through what the EPA, what role it has, but for the most part, there are very, very few states where the EPA actually is the one that approves these. It is either state or local. All right. So my question to you is, why again you're leaving that piece out? And I think that decision making is very important.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I'd be glad to. If you answer the question directly.
Yeah. One of the assumptions that a lot of folks on the Democrat side have been making is that when the EPA comes out with this new proposal, that it's something great. It's something that's actually going to improve health. The problem is too often, when the EPA says, trust me, the EPA is not sincere in what they're bringing forward because there is no science to show how it can be done. We're asking them to show how it can be done.
Time, I think by not answering the question...
I'm answering the question. You might not like the answer.
No, because you keep talking about the EPA.
But this bill deals with the EPA.
That I made for 10 years at the Air District Board in the San Francisco Bay Area region and all the counties there. I'll yield to Mr. West.
The gentleman's absolutely incorrect. Before a standard is set, there is a full procedure for scientific basis in order to promulgate that standard. We're talking about a standard that's been promulgated to protect public health. That's the standard. Mm-hmm. This is not in dispute. That will be the standard that will apply everywhere in the country, because we want people in Louisiana and California and Kansas to breathe air that's healthy and not have to breathe air that's going to harm them because the pollution is so heavy. So the standard is set. This is only a question of what the local area would decide for meeting the standard with all the industries that add pollution into the air. And the bill says if it's a new source, the local people may not make them meet a higher standard and do more to reduce their pollution until EPA gives some guidance. But it's not up to EPA, it's up to the local government, and this bill takes away the power from the local government. And your question was never answered. Why do they want to tell the local government that they can't protect the health of their own people? Why do we hear the argument on the other side that it's either new jobs and then forget about the health protection? Don't we want to do both? And we've done both. The Clean Air Act has been around since 1970. It's enormously successful. We've had reduced air pollution, and our economy has grown. But if you hear the Republican arguments, don't protect public health, it's just a waste. It's something they made up. It's not based on science. Again, that denial of science we hear over and over again from the Republicans if their industries want to complain about it or their ideology wants them to make that kind of argument. It's just disingenuous. The standard is set based on the science. It can be challenged if it doesn't meet the requirements under the Clean Air Law. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, with 15 seconds left, I mentioned that I served on the Air District Board for a decade. I think that those decisions are very important decisions made by people in a region or the state. And I think to leapfrog over that or to totally disregard it, I have respect for the gentleman from Louisiana, but he really did not answer my question forthrightly. And so I think this amendment of Mr. McNerney's is important for all the reasons that he stated, but also for the reasons that I have. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen none. Oh, gentleman from New York.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word. I support my colleague's amendment. As I said earlier, Section 3 of the bill creates confusion and is likely to complicate the regulatory process for new facilities under the Clean Air Act. New facilities or significantly refurbished existing facilities would meet less stringent air standards in cases where EPA did not issue all implementation guidance at the same time that a new standard is established. In his testimony, Mr. O'Mara from the Delaware State Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control expressed his concern that this legislation would lead to uncertainty for applicants and uncertainty for state agencies, and would likely result in delays and litigation. These are not the ingredients for streamlining the establishment of new manufacturing facilities or any other type of facility. Our colleague's amendment maintains a state's control over their air quality permitting process. It gives the state discretion to implement this section of the law or not based on their experience, their unique circumstances, and their evaluation of its impact. If the state finds that this provision would create uncertainty or increase litigation, thereby slowing down their permitting process, the state can waive the requirement in Section 3 of this bill. Our colleague's amendment preserves a state's authority to implement the Clean Air Act, and I think that's a sound improvement. I urge the committee to adopt this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Oregon.
Seek recognition and strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I would yield to the gentleman from Louisiana, such time as he may consume.
Well, thank the gentleman for yielding. Just to be clear, what we're talking about with Section 3B is putting accountability onto EPA. If you want an answer to the question, you might not like the answer to the question, but the candid reason that you want to put accountability in place is because too often we see EPA come out with these new standards and rules that aren't based in the real world. They aren't based in something that's achievable or practical. And they know that. They don't have, there's some secret black box maybe where they're saying, trust us, this is how you can do it. We're just not going to show you. All we say in our bill is if you're going to come out with a new standard, you have to give the guidance to go along with it. If it's real, if it's achievable, obviously you've done the research for months, you've been planning this thing. Just show people how it can be done. Show people how it can be done. And if that's some burden that you think is too high and you want a state to be able to opt the federal government out of accountability, why would we want to remove accountability from the federal government? When ultimately it's our local people in those communities that are hurt when the EPA is not held accountable. Because the EPA has been on a rampage destroying jobs in this country. They have. You talk to any manufacturer, look at the groups that are supporting this bill. The Small Business Entrepreneurial Council, the National Association of Manufacturers, American Chemistry Council, U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They want to create jobs in America. They don't want to destroy the health of our country. Of course they don't. They stand for high standards. They just say, if you're going to have a standard, show us how it can be done. Give us that guidance so we don't have to go create those jobs in China. Now, maybe the Chinese Chamber of Commerce is against this bill. Maybe they'd like this amendment. But we shouldn't be here trying to defend them and Chinese jobs. We ought to be trying to figure out if there's a standard that's coming out by the EPA, just give them some accountability and say, show us how you can do it. Not to exempt them and give them some new loophole so that they don't have to be held accountable.
Gentlemen,
That's
yield.
the honest answer.
Gentlemen, yield. You're not doing anything to harm EPA for their failure. You're hurting the local community from making a decision to protect the health of their own people.
With all due respect, the bill says, and go read it, the bill actually says you have to use the latest technology. You have to use it. It says that. It doesn't deny them the ability to have to
the
follow
local
standards.
people may say
what
that's
the bill
not enough,
also does.
Excuse me, I
You won't
control
let
the
them do
time,
it.
actually.
Yeah.
So Mr. Scalise has the time.
Thank you. Thank you for continuing to yield, because ultimately what the bill does is it protects American jobs from an overzealous EPA. And if you don't think the EPA has been overzealous, you haven't been paying attention to what's been going on across this country. The
Do you
job
think the
destruction,
local government
the
has been overzealous?
If I can reclaim my time, Mr. Chairman. The increase in electricity payments that every single hardworking taxpayer is facing right now. Seniors on fixed income that are paying higher energy prices because of this EPA and this administration's war on coal. It's real. People are paying higher costs right now, not for higher standards, for higher health. It's because they want to carry out some agenda. They don't like fossil fuels. They've got a radical agenda, and they don't care what the science says. If they want to come out with a new standard, and they know it's not going to be achievable, they just want to shut a coal plant down. They just want to stop an oil well from being drilled because they've got their own agenda that's anti-fossil fuel. Well, you know, if that's their agenda, then come out. Y'all had the cap and trade bill. It didn't even pass a Democrat-controlled Senate because people said, we're tired of this stuff. We're tired of these crazy regulations that are killing jobs for no good purpose, to send jobs to China where they emit 5 times the amount of carbon. That's what's happening in the real world. So to live in the real world. If you want the EPA to come out with a new standard that's based on science, then show the science. Bring it forward. Show how you can actually achieve it. Don't let some state exempt the EPA from accountability. The EPA ought to be held accountable. Every administration agency ought to be held accountability. Look what's going on at the VA right now. You've got an administration that can't run a VA hospital. They can't roll out a website with over $500 million of taxpayer money, but they think they can control the weather? And they're going to tell you that you can't create your jobs in America, run them off to China because we got some newfangled idea that's going to save everybody from dying. But we can't show you how it can be done. Just trust us. We're the EPA. We're the federal government. We're tired of this. There's a real world out there. There are people that are struggling in hard times. They're tired of paying higher electricity prices. They're tired of waiting in the unemployment line. Let's get people back to work. If it makes sense, show the standard. That's what the bill says. Show the guidance to go with the new rule, and if it doesn't, if it's junk science, then go back to your cubbyhole and come up with some new way of actually trying to do your job and get people to work instead of put people out of work. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen none. The vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Opinion chair, noes have it. Noes have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes no. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Dr. Murphy?
Mr. Murphy votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seen none. The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 29 nays.
19 ayes, 29 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4795 to the House. All those in favor shall say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. You need a chair. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorse Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Billrackus. Mr. Billrackus votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes no. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welsh. Mr. Welsh votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Mr. Yarmouth. Mr. Yarmouth votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes aye.
Members wishing to cast a vote, Ms. DeGette.
Ms. DeGette votes no.
Other members? Dr. Murphy?
Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Other members? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 30 ayes and 19 nays.
30 ayes, 19 nays. The bill is favorably reported. The chair will now call up H.R. 4801 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4801 to require the Secretary of Energy to prepare a report on the impact of thermal insulation on both energy and water use for portable hot water.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any other amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4801 to the House. All those in favor shall say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. Chair will now call up H.R. 4299 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4299 to amend the Controlled Substances Act with respect to drug scheduling recommendations by the Secretary of Health and Human Services and with respect to registration of manufacturers and distributors seeking to conduct clinical testing.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is also now dispensed with. The bill will be open for any for amendment at any point. So ordered. Any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4299 to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. If you need a chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is favorably reported. The chair now will call up H.R. 4709 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 4709 to improve enforcement efforts related to prescription drug diversion and abuse and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. The chair now would recognize Ms. Blackburn to offer an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have an amendment at the desk. It is a bipartisan amendment on behalf of Mr. Welch and I. It is a technical correction on page 4, line 5. You will notice it is down as the Director of National Drug Control Policy.
Let me just ask the clerk to report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4709 offered by Mrs. Blackburn of Tennessee and Mr. Welsh of Vermont.
Clerk, or the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment. Shh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, this is a technical correction. In drafting the bill, Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy was listed as Director of National Drug Control Policy. So this just inserts of the Office of. And we want to get it correct before it is passed out of committee. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 5 minutes.
I just want to reiterate what the Vice Chair said. This issue, Mr. Marino, our colleague, who was a leader in this, and Judy Chu as well, is a real concern about trying to figure out how we can work with our drug companies and our drug distributors and our FDA and law enforcement, where we've got in all of our states, but this is a big issue in Vermont, a significant problem of drug abuse and prescription drug abuse, and where there's a need for enforcement, and the distributing companies want to cooperate with that, but it's absolutely essential that there be clarity about who's doing what in order that in the enforcement we don't deny access to appropriate medication for people who actually need it. So I thank the Vice Chair for her efforts on this, along with our other colleagues, Mr. Marino and Congresswoman Chu, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4709 as amended to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The bill is favorably reported as amended. The Chair now calls up the final bill, H.R. 4631, and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 4631 to reauthorize certain provisions of the Public Health Service Act relating to autism and for other purposes.
And without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered, and the Chair will recognize himself to offer an amendment, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print of H.R. 4631 offered by Mr. Upton of Michigan.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes in support of the bill, support of the amendment. This amendment that I'm offering represents a cooperative effort by the House and Senate to reauthorize the bill in a timely fashion, continuing the important activities to study autism spectrum disorders and provide necessary services and supports. This amendment changes the title of the bill to Autism Collaboration, Accountability, Research, Education, and Support, CARES is the acronym, Act of 2014. It also asks the Secretary of HHS to prepare and submit a report concerning young adults with autism spectrum disorder and the challenges related to the transition to adulthood. Is there further discussion? And I yield back my time. Would recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Nice for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank my colleagues here in the Energy and Commerce Committee, along with Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey, for their work on this important legislation. The latest autism numbers are simply astounding, and they show why it's essential that Congress continue to address autism spectrum disorders. More than 1 million people in the United States have an autism spectrum disorder. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention's most recent data show a continued rise in autism prevalence rates, 1 in every 68 American children. That's 1 in 189 girls and 1 in 42 boys. These are staggering numbers, and we can't afford to ignore this issue. As many of you know, Chris Smith and I formed the Congressional Autism Caucus 13 years ago to help make research on autism a national priority. Since then, Congress has supported billions of dollars in research on autism spectrum disorders. As a result, we have a much better understanding of ASD. We understand that early diagnosis and treatment can make a tremendous difference in the development of children with autism. These advances has given us some answers and hope to the thousands of families across the country with someone on the spectrum. Many federal autism programs were first authorized by the Combating Autism Act of 2006, which provided essential funding for research, early identification, and the promotion of early intervention for children with autism. This legislation has made a huge difference in the life of autistic Americans and their families. Since its inception, Congress has reauthorized this federal autism program twice. Without new legislation to reauthorize them, the funding for these important programs will expire on September 30th, 2014. We have made tremendous advances in understanding autism spectrum disorders, but much of this progress could be lost if Congress allows these programs to expire. That is why it is so important that Congress pass common sense, bipartisan, bicameral legislation like the bill before us today. In addition to reauthorizing funding for research and activities at the CDC and the NIH, this bill includes needed reforms to the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. And it adds additional safeguards to ensure that interagency coordination is improved and that taxpayers' dollars are spent efficiently. To assist with the increased coordination and reduced duplication of resources, the bill calls for the designation of a specific individual at the Department of Health and Human Services to monitor the implementation of the IACT strategic plan and report to Congress on their observations. Finally, in recognition of the challenges faced by young adults who are aging out of the public school system, this bill would also require a review of services available to young adults with ASD and the challenges related to the transition from existing school-based services to those services available to adults. I doubt if anyone would argue against an increased focus on services for individuals with autism or for more federal resources for services to help young adults with ASD who are making this often difficult transition. I think this review is critical for determining the level of need that currently exists so that we can move forward and adequately addressing this issue. I hope that I've been able to convey just how important these federal autism programs are to many families and individuals across the country. Inaction is not an option. With those closing comments, I would urge my colleagues to support the Autism Cares legislation, and I thank the chairman for the time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrich.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I first want to commend the bipartisan product that we have before us here today as we move H.R. 4631 forward. I hope that I can work with you and the staff on committee report language regarding the emphasis of early diagnosis of autism prior to age 5. I know that this is of critical importance for the Markup Autism Center, Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. It's my hope to include in report language to reflect this importance, and I'd like to work with you on that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, of course.
I just want to say I would look forward to sitting down with you. I also appreciate the passionate remarks by Mr. Doyle as well. This is an issue that every one of us cares about. We do have a pending deadline in a few months, and I'm going to do all that I can to make sure that we get this legislation scheduled on the House floor to allow the Senate to hopefully take it up. I want to appreciate the staff has worked with the Senate side. We're hoping that they'll accept the bill that we do. Obviously, we need a good vote on this, but we're gonna try to do all that we can to fast track it. But I look forward to sitting down with you and as it relates to every state across the country.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize, I think, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus. Were you looking for that? Mr. Terry.
Thank you. And as a member of the Autism Caucus and having many friends that unfortunately have children with autism, I'm proud to support this bill. I want to thank Mr. Doyle for his work and Phil for yours on this. Obviously, this is for many families kind of the disease of our generation. It's exploding in the amount of diagnoses every year, but yet finding the right research to be able to manage the disease and maybe even hopefully sometime in the future learn how to stop the disease, is extremely important. So the efficiencies that are built into this reauthorization on the research into the disease is extremely important. But how to manage the disease, as Dr. Gingrich mentioned, the early diagnosis and the type of therapies after that diagnosis are extremely important on how that child develops and whether or not they can have a higher level of productivity in their adult years. So this is an important bill for our country overall, and I'm proud to support it, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further members,
Mr. Chairman?
additional members? Gentlelady from Illinois.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Oh, we're still on our amendment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Are there further members wishing to speak on my amendment? If not, the issue is the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the chairman. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion is chair. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Gentlelady from Illinois.
Yes.
You have an amendment at the desk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the title.
Amendment to the committee print of H.R. 4631, offered by Ms. Schakowsky of Illinois.
And the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
I join my colleagues in applauding the bicameral and bipartisan work to reauthorize this important legislation, and I'm glad that we can all work together on such an important issue. And I do believe that reauthorizing this legislation in the way that we are brings great improvements to our ability to address autism. I just wanted to offer a couple other proposals brought to me by autism advocates that we should consider in the future to continue to improve our ability to meet those needs. Self-advocates, people with autism, provide important insight into the needs and priorities of the autism community. As the number of youth with autism entering adulthood continues to grow, I believe that we should take advantage of the increased ability to include self-advocates in federal autism efforts. Today, individuals with autism make up a small minority of public members appointed to the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, IACC, which is the federal body that coordinates all efforts concerning autism within the Department of Health and Human Services. And I applaud the provision of the reauthorization legislation that would increase the floor for self-advocate members on the IACC from 1 to 2. While I agree this is an important step in recognizing the valuable input that self-advocates contribute to federal autism efforts, I hope that in the future we can look at increasing the statutory floor of self-advocate members on the IACC. Increasing the voice of self-advocates will only improve our efforts. I urge Secretary Burwell to treat the requirement of 2 members as a floor and not a ceiling for self-advocate representation on the IACC. And in addition to increasing their input there, we should increase self-advocates' input into leadership, education, in neurodevelopmental and related disabilities program, or LEND program, and the Regional Centers of Excellence. My amendment would achieve this by convening an advisory council for each LEND program and Regional Center of Excellence, of which the majority of members would be individuals with autism or other developmental disabilities. My amendment would also require each LEND program to recruit qualified trainees with autism spectrum disorder or other developmental disabilities. My amendment would also make additional improvements to existing law to ensure that LEND programs incorporate an emphasis on issues impacting autistic adults, women and girls, and racial and ethnic minorities as part of their delivery of culturally competent services. This is particularly important since we know the number of boys identified with autism far outnumber the number of girls. While I strongly support continued research efforts into the causes, early detection, prevention, and treatment of autism, we should do more to increase federally sponsored research into how to improve the quality of services, support employment, inclusive education, and other fields related to community integration for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Thus far, federally sponsored research into such efforts has been quite limited. For example, in 2010, the most recent year for which there is data, only 2.4% of NIH's autism research budget went toward research on improving service quality. Again, I appreciate all the hard work of members on both sides of the aisle in both chambers to develop the reauthorization legislation. I hope that after passage of bipartisan bicameral reauthorization, we can continue to work together on efforts that continue to improve federal autism initiatives and increase the representation of self-advocates in those efforts. Perhaps there's something in report language that could be included. I also encourage Secretary Burwell to implement the reauthorization in a fashion that maximizes input from individuals with autism who are most immediately impacted by federal autism efforts. And at this time, I would like to withdraw my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady withdraws her amendment. I just, again, want to compliment all members, and particularly the Autism Caucus. They do a very valuable job, and it's something that is we're going to continue to work on in a very strong bipartisan way. And I appreciate the gentlelady's interest. I know it's very genuine and one that we need to work on. Are the other members wishing to further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 4631 as amended to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. If you need a chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is adopted. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation reported by the committee today. So ordered. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.